What would you do if everything you owned, your home, your family's legacy, was stolen right in front of you? What if the system was rigged against you? The courtroom was just a stage for corruption, and the people in power laughed in your face, knowing you didn't stand a chance. This is the story of Elijah Carter, a man who walked into a courtroom alone, mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, but who refused to back down. What he uncovered would shake the entire system. Where are you watching from today? If you love stories of justice, resilience, and triumph, don't forget to subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told and join us for more powerful narratives. Elijah Carter tightened his grip on the worn leather briefcase in his hand, though there was nothing inside but a few neatly stacked documents and a notebook filled with his scribbled research. The air inside the Montgomery County Courthouse was thick with the scent of polished wood and cold authority, the kind that had never favored men like him. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him as he made his way down the long hallway leading to Courtroom 3B, his every step echoing in the quiet. This wasn't just any case. This was his grandmother's home, the house she had lived in for over 60 years. The house his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands after coming home from the war. It was more than just bricks and mortar. It was history. It was his family's legacy. And today, it was being stolen right in front of him by men in expensive suits who had never worked a day in their lives. At the end of the hall, a towering mahogany door stood slightly ajar, revealing the courtroom inside. As Elijah stepped forward, he caught sight of Conrad Whitmore sitting at the plaintiff's table. The man looked exactly like he had in the news reports, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that cost more than Elijah made in a year. A real estate tycoon with a smile that never reached his eyes, Conrad had built his empire swallowing up homes like Elijah's, one foreclosure at a time. And now, he was here to take the last thing Elijah had left. "Mr. Carter, is it?" The voice slithered toward him from the other side of the room. Graham Sloan, Conrad's top attorney, stood from his seat with an air of theatrical boredom, brushing non-existent lint off his lapel. The man was as sharp as a razor and twice as cruel, known for crushing small-time homeowners in courtrooms just like this one. Elijah met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "That's right." Sloan smirked, his teeth white against his perfectly tanned skin. "You know, I have to admire your determination," he said, stepping closer. "It's almost inspiring." His voice was thick with mockery, the kind that crawled under a man's skin and made his blood boil. Elijah didn't respond. He knew the game Sloan was playing. Sloan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper only Elijah could hear. "You don't belong here." Elijah felt the words sink into his bones. This wasn't just about the law. It never had been. This was about power. About the kind of men who sat in rooms like this, rewriting the rules to make sure people like Elijah never stood a chance. "Mr. Sloan." A gravelly voice cut through the tension, sending a hush through the room. Judge Samuel Pickett entered through the side door, his robe flowing around his stocky frame like a cloak of authority. He was a bulldog of a man, his deep-set eyes calculating as he took his seat at the bench. Elijah had done his homework. He knew Pickett's history. The judge had a reputation for siding with corporations over individuals, for viewing homeowners like Elijah as nuisances clogging up the system. This man had already made up his mind before Elijah had even stepped into the room. "Let's get this over with," Judge Pickett muttered, flipping through a file. "Plaintiff's counsel, proceed." Sloan turned, his smug confidence returning as he buttoned his jacket and sauntered toward the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as polished steel, "this is not a complicated case. The law is clear. The facts are clear. Mr. Carter's grandmother failed to meet the financial obligations of her mortgage. The bank rightfully foreclosed, and my client, Whitmore Enterprises, legally acquired the property. There is no injustice here." Elijah clenched his fists under the table. Lies. His grandmother never missed a payment. She had been the most responsible woman he had ever known. Yet, somehow, months after her stroke, a notice of foreclosure had appeared on her door, one she had never seen, never signed, never acknowledged. The defendant, Sloan continued, gesturing vaguely in Elijah's direction as if he were an afterthought, is simply unwilling to accept reality. He has no legal claim to the property. He has no lawyer, no case, no evidence. A smirk played at the edge of his lips. This is nothing more than a man drowning in sentiment, unwilling to face the truth. A chuckle rippled through the corporate side of the courtroom. Elijah's stomach churned. They weren't just trying to take his home, they were trying to make a spectacle out of him, to humiliate him. Elijah took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep his voice steady as he stood. "Your Honor," he said, turning to Judge Pickett, "Mr. Sloan makes an interesting claim." The judge lifted a brow. Sloan sighed dramatically, already bored. "Oh, do I?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, because I happen to have documents right here that prove my grandmother never missed a mortgage payment." In fact, he pulled a folder from his case, his fingers steady despite the fire in his chest. She was ahead on her payments. Sloan froze for half a second, but that was all Elijah needed to see. Judge Pickett exhaled through his nose. "Bring them forward." Elijah stepped toward the bailiff, a white man in his mid-50s with small, beady eyes that never met Elijah's directly. As Elijah handed over the folder, the man snatched it from his grip a little too forcefully, his fingers brushing against Elijah's wrist before he muttered under his breath, "Should have known better, boy." Elijah's stomach tightened like a fist. He stared at the man, feeling something dark and familiar rise in his chest. He knew exactly what that was. The same venom his grandfather had fought against marching through these same streets decades ago. He turned back to the judge, refusing to let it shake him. Judge Pickett flipped through the documents lazily, barely even reading them, before snapping the folder shut. "This doesn't prove anything," he said dismissively. Elijah felt the floor tilt beneath him. Sloan's smirk widened. "Well, that was cute." Elijah's chest burned. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for it. But watching a judge flat out ignore evidence right in front of him, that was something else entirely. This wasn't justice. This was a performance. And the verdict had been written before the curtains had even gone up. Elijah slowly sat back down, his jaw tight, his pulse hammering behind his eyes. They wanted him to break, to rage, to prove their expectations right. But Elijah Carter had never been one to break. Instead, he reached into his briefcase for the real evidence. The thing that was going to turn this whole case upside down. And none of them saw it coming. Elijah Carter knew the game was rigged, but knowing it and experiencing it firsthand were two different things. As he sat at the defendant's table, gripping the edge of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white, he felt the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him. It wasn't just the physical space, the polished wood, the heavy chandeliers, the cold, sterile air of authority that didn't belong to him. It was the people, the ones who had already made up their minds before he even spoke. Across the room, Conrad Whitmore leaned back in his seat, arms folded, his lips curved into a smirk. He looked like a man watching a fly struggle against a spider's web, amused, confident, and completely uninterested in the outcome, because he already knew how this would end. And then there was Graham Sloan, pacing in front of the jury box like he was performing for an audience of one, Judge Samuel Pickett. His tailored suit, flawless posture, and self-satisfied smirk all worked together to project an air of absolute control. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to end this quickly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sloan began, turning toward the jury with a practiced, almost lazy smile. "We all sympathize with the defendant. Losing a home is tragic, but emotions don't override facts. And the fact is," he turned and pointed at Elijah without even looking at him, "Mr. Carter's grandmother failed to pay her property taxes. The city issued multiple warnings, and when the foreclosure process began, Mr. Carter did nothing to stop it. The law is clear." Elijah's stomach twisted. The bold-faced lie was enough to make his head spin. "She never missed a payment," he said, his voice steady but firm. Sloan barely acknowledged him. He turned back to the jury, ignoring Elijah like he wasn't even there. "We understand the emotional weight of this case," Sloan continued, his voice smooth as silk. It's easy to blame corporations, easy to see them as villains. But let's be honest here. He chuckled, shaking his head. This isn't about corruption. This isn't about injustice. This is about responsibility. The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Elijah's neck. Objection. Elijah stood, holding up the documents he had spent weeks gathering. That's not true. My grandmother was fully paid up on her mortgage and taxes. I have proof, Sloan sighed, barely concealing his boredom. Your Honor, I move to dismiss the defendant's so-called evidence as inadmissible. These documents were not obtained through the proper legal channels. Elijah's stomach dropped. Judge Pickett, without even looking at the papers, gave a dismissive wave. Sustained. Elijah blinked in disbelief. Sloan smiled. Conrad smirked. The jury barely reacted. Elijah tightened his fists, feeling the slow burn of helplessness crawl up his spine. Your Honor, he tried again. I have original bank statements. Sloan let out an exaggerated sigh, turning toward him like he was scolding a child. Mr. Carter, do you even understand how the legal system works? He said, shaking his head in mock pity. There are rules for submitting evidence. Procedures. You can't just walk in here, slam some papers on the table, and expect to win. Laughter rippled through the corporate side of the room. Elijah felt it like a slap to the face. The mockery. The dismissal. The sheer audacity of men who knew they had all the power and weren't afraid to show it. From the corner of his eye, he saw Conrad's assistant, a young blonde woman dressed in designer clothes, raise her hands and pretend to clap with a smirk. Conrad himself let out a quiet chuckle, muttering something to the man beside him. Elijah couldn't hear it, but he didn't need to. The meaning was clear. This was a joke to them. Elijah's chest burned with frustration, but he forced himself to breathe. Control it. Stay focused. Because this was exactly what they wanted. For him to get angry, to lose control, to give them the satisfaction of watching him unravel. He wasn't going to give them that. Instead, he turned back to Judge Pickett, his voice even but firm. Your Honor, he said, I respectfully request the court to review the financial records related to this foreclosure. I have reason to believe there are inconsistencies in how this mortgage was processed. Pickett barely looked up. Denied. The word hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. The courtroom felt smaller now, the air thicker. He looked around, at the jury that wasn't paying attention, at Conrad's smirking face, at Sloan, who looked like he had already won. And then, suddenly, a hand on his shoulder. Elijah turned, coming face to face with the bailiff, a man in his 50s with cold blue eyes and a tight-lipped sneer. The bailiff leaned in close, his breath warm against Elijah's ear. Just give up, boy. You already lost. The words sent a shock through Elijah's body, but he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give them the reaction they wanted. But inside, he was shaking with fury. He stared ahead, locking eyes with Conrad, who watched the whole exchange like a man observing a chess piece being moved exactly where he wanted it. The feeling that this had all been pre-decided settled over Elijah like a suffocating weight. The trap had been set long before he walked into this room. The evidence didn't matter. The law didn't matter. All that mattered was power. Sloan turned back toward the judge, his voice casual, almost mockingly polite. Your Honor, I believe we've wasted enough of this court's valuable time. The defendant has no legal standing, no proper evidence, and frankly, no business representing himself. I move for an immediate ruling in favor of my client. Elijah's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Pickett didn't even hesitate. Mr. Carter, he said, do you have anything substantial to add, or are you just stalling? The words were sharp, full of unspoken meaning. Elijah felt the entire weight of the system pressing down on him. Everything in this room was designed to break him, to make him walk away quietly, to send a message to anyone else like him who might try to fight back. But Elijah Carter had never been one to walk away. He swallowed the fury boiling beneath his skin and did the only thing he could do. He turned to Sloan and smiled. Not defeat, but something else. A flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Because while they had been mocking him, dismissing him, trying to tear him down, they hadn't noticed what he had been doing. They hadn't noticed the trap he was setting for them, and that mistake was about to cost them everything. Would you like the next part? Comment 1 if you want to see more, 2 if you want us to stop, so we know. Elijah Carter sat in his car outside the courthouse, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath coming out in sharp, uneven exhales. He had lost today. Badly. Judge Pickett had barely glanced at his evidence before dismissing it. Graham Sloan had mocked him like a schoolyard bully who knew the teacher would never intervene. Conrad Whitmore had watched the whole thing like a king surveying his conquered land. And the jury? They hadn't even been paying attention. Elijah clenched his jaw, staring straight ahead. This wasn't about justice. It never had been. This was about power, the kind of power that made it easy for men like Conrad Whitmore to buy their way into people's homes and lives, strip them of everything, and walk away richer and untouchable. For the first time, Elijah felt the smallest flicker of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was pointless. He could already hear the voices whispering in his head. You don't belong here. Just give up, boy. You already lost. People like you can't win against people like us. He closed his eyes, trying to block them out. And then, a memory. His grandmother, sitting on the porch of their home, rocking in her favorite chair, her wise eyes watching the world with the kind of quiet strength only someone who had survived too much could have. If you don't stand up, they'll take everything. She had said it to him once when he was a child, after a schoolteacher had wrongfully accused him of stealing a classmate's lunch money. He had wanted to let it go, to just move on. But she wouldn't let him. If you don't stand up, they'll take everything. Elijah opened his eyes. No, he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. He put the car in drive and headed home. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, documents spread out in front of him, legal textbooks stacked beside his laptop, coffee gone cold in his mug. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, his mind racing through every detail, every signature, every stamped approval. There had to be something. Some small, overlooked mistake. Some crack in the armor of the unbreakable machine that was Whitmore Enterprises. And then he saw it. Elijah stilled, his breath catching in his throat. The signature on his grandmother's original mortgage didn't match the signature on the foreclosure transfer document. It was subtle. Someone had clearly tried to forge it carefully, but to Elijah, who had watched his grandmother sign checks, birthday cards, and letters his entire life, it was obvious. This wasn't her handwriting. And then he saw something even worse. The notary who had approved the document, Linda Wilkes. His stomach dropped. He flipped open his laptop and searched the state's notary public database. His hands shook as he typed in her name. No results found. Elijah's heart pounded. She wasn't a notary. She never had been. Which meant the document was invalid. Which meant the entire foreclosure process had been illegal. His pulse raced as he scrambled to grab his phone, his fingers fumbling as he scrolled through pages of legal codes. If a foreclosure was based on fraudulent documentation, it was void. Completely. Elijah inhaled sharply. This was bigger than he thought. And then an even darker thought crept in. If they did this to my grandmother, how many others? He needed to know. He opened his laptop again, this time searching every foreclosure that Whitmore Enterprises had been involved in over the past 5 years. What he found made his stomach turn. Elijah spent the next 4 hours poring over public records, mortgage transfers, and court filings. The deeper he dug, the more sickeningly clear the pattern became. His grandmother wasn't the only one. There were dozens of cases. All of them had something in common. Homes owned by black families in historically black neighborhoods. And all of them had one or more documents notarized by Linda Wilkes. Wilkes, who didn't exist. Elijah pushed back from the table, his hands shaking. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This was a scam. A fraud. A massive, calculated effort to steal homes from black homeowners and funnel them into the hands of real estate tycoons like Conrad Whitmore. The rage that had been simmering inside him boiled over. This wasn't about one house. This was about an entire community being stripped of its legacy, one fraudulent signature at a time. Elijah's chest heaved as he stared at the papers in front of him. They thought he was just one man. They thought he didn't have a chance. They had no idea what was coming. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He knew what had to be done. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After 2 rings, a groggy but familiar voice answered. "Elijah? You do know it's 2 in the morning, right?" Elijah exhaled slowly. "I need your help, Vanessa." There was a pause, a sigh, and then, "I'm listening." Vanessa Caldwell, his cousin, a corporate attorney who had left Montgomery years ago after growing tired of fighting an unwinnable war against the city's corrupt legal system. But Elijah wasn't giving her a choice this time. "I have proof," he said, "that Whitmore Enterprises has been illegally stealing homes from black homeowners. Dozens of them. And I can prove it." The line went silent. And then Vanessa's voice changed. Gone was the sleepiness, replaced with something cold and razor-sharp. "Where are you?" Elijah glanced at the scattered papers around him. "Home. I'll be there in 20 minutes." He hung up, staring at the wall, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Tomorrow, he would walk back into that rigged courtroom. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every family that had been robbed. He was fighting for his grandmother, for his community, for justice. And he wasn't going down without a war. Elijah has uncovered the truth, but will it be enough? How do you feel knowing that powerful men like Conrad Whitmore can steal homes from hardworking families and get away with it? If you were in Elijah's shoes, would you have the strength to keep fighting, even when the entire system is against you? And here's the real question. If Elijah has proof of fraud, why is Judge Pickett so eager to shut him down? Could it be that the corruption goes even deeper than he thought? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because Elijah's battle is far from over. Elijah stood outside courtroom 3B, gripping a folder so tightly his fingers ached. This wasn't just his last chance. It was the moment that would decide whether the truth would see the light of day or be buried beneath the weight of corruption. He had spent the entire night going over every piece of evidence, double-checking every forged document, every fraudulent mortgage transfer. And now, he was ready. No more dismissals. No more smirks from Conrad Whitmore. No more mockery from Graham Sloan. No more games. Today, he was going to expose them all. As he took a deep breath and pushed the heavy doors open, all eyes turned to him. Sloan's smirk was already in place. Conrad sat back in his chair, completely at ease, as if he had already won. Judge Samuel Pickett adjusted his glasses and exhaled through his nose, already annoyed that Elijah was here again. They thought they had crushed him. They had no idea what was coming. Elijah walked to the defendant's table, placed his folder down, and cleared his throat. His voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I need to bring an urgent matter to this court's attention." Judge Pickett barely looked up. "Mr. Carter, you are here to answer for your failure to vacate a legally foreclosed property. If you have anything useful to say regarding that matter, proceed. Otherwise, I suggest you sit down." Elijah didn't blink. "Actually, I have something that changes everything." A ripple of curiosity moved through the courtroom. Sloan rolled his eyes, sighing loudly. "Your Honor, this is yet another baseless attempt to delay the inevitable. We all know Mr. Carter has no legal standing in this case." Elijah ignored him and picked up the first document from his folder. "This is a copy of my grandmother's original mortgage," he said. "Signed, dated, and notarized. Now, this," he held up the second document, "is the mortgage modification that supposedly justified the foreclosure. You'll notice something very important." Judge Pickett looked unimpressed. "And that would be—" Elijah stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "The signatures don't match." The courtroom fell silent. Sloan's smirk faltered for just a second before he quickly regained his composure. "That's absurd," he said, laughing lightly. "Handwriting changes over time. This is meaningless." Elijah shook his head. "I thought that too. So I dug deeper." He pulled out the next document. "This is the notary record for that modification. And there's just one problem. He turned, locking eyes with Conrad. The notary, Linda Wilkes, doesn't exist. Gasps rippled through the audience. Conrad's jaw tightened. Judge Pickett shifted in his chair, looking less comfortable now. Elijah pressed forward. I ran a search through the state's notary database. There is no record of Linda Wilkes ever being certified, which means this document was falsified. Which means, he turned to the judge, his next words deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. This foreclosure was illegal. A murmur spread across the courtroom. Even the jury, who had barely paid attention before, was now leaning forward. Sloan stood abruptly. Your Honor, I move to strike these claims as speculative nonsense. The defendant has provided no expert testimony, no legal precedent. Elijah didn't let him finish. I'm not done. He pulled out one final document, his hand steady. This is a list of other foreclosures handled by Whitmore Enterprises in the last 5 years. 43 black homeowners. 43 cases where forged documents were used. The room exploded into murmurs. Conrad's face lost its arrogance. Sloan took a step toward the judge, urgency in his voice now. Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to slander my client's reputation. None of these claims. Are you saying these documents are false, Mr. Sloan? The words came not from Elijah, but from the judge. Pickett, for the first time, actually looked concerned. And that's when Elijah saw it. The hesitation. The nervous flicker in the judge's eyes. Because Pickett wasn't just corrupt, he was part of it. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Conrad wasn't smiling anymore. Sloan's confidence had cracked. And Judge Pickett? Judge Pickett was sweating. Then, suddenly, the gavel slammed against the bench. Mr. Carter, the judge said, his tone colder now. This court does not tolerate baseless accusations and theatrics. Elijah's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. You were dangerously close to being held in contempt. Elijah took a step forward. I am presenting evidence of widespread fraud. Pickett cut him off. Enough. The judge turned to the bailiffs. Remove him from my courtroom. Elijah froze. What? Before he could react, hands grabbed him hard. The bailiffs yanked him backward, gripping his arms so tightly pain shot up his shoulders. The courtroom gasped. What the hell are you doing? Elijah struggled, rage surging through him. Judge Pickett didn't even look at him. This is my courtroom, Mr. Carter, and I will not have it disrupted by baseless conspiracy theories. Elijah thrashed against the hold of the bailiffs, but their grip tightened painfully. Then, as they dragged him past the plaintiff's table, Sloan leaned in close, his voice a low whisper. You overstepped, boy. This isn't your world. Something inside Elijah snapped. But before he could do anything, he was shoved through the courtroom doors and into the hallway. The last thing he saw before the doors slammed shut, Conrad Whitmore, watching it all with a satisfied smirk. The cell was cold, damp, and smelled of sweat and mildew. Elijah sat on the hard metal bench, his hands still sore from how tightly they had been restrained. Contempt of court. That was the charge. But he knew the truth. This was punishment. This was a message. They wanted him silenced, humiliated, buried. Because he had found something they never expected him to find. The cold steel bars in front of Elijah Carter felt heavier than they should have. The dim fluorescent light flickered above him, casting long shadows along the cracked cement floor. He had spent the night in jail, not for a crime, but for daring to expose one. His muscles ached from the way the bailiffs had handled him, but none of that mattered. He had come so close. So damn close. Judge Pickett had played his hand too well. He had silenced Elijah before the truth could fully take root. Conrad Whitmore and Graham Sloan had walked out of that courtroom untouched, smirking, believing they had won. But what they didn't know, the truth had already escaped. Hours passed. Elijah sat on the bench in his cell, lost in thought, replaying every second of the trial. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know what would happen next. And then a guard approached, peering through the bars with narrowed eyes. Who the hell are you? He muttered, unlocking the cell door. Elijah frowned. What? You got a damn army outside. Elijah's heart stopped. The guard led him toward the front desk, And that's when he saw it. His name was everywhere. Beyond the holding cell windows, a sea of people had gathered outside the jail. Hundreds, no, thousands chanting his name, holding signs. Phones were raised, cameras rolling, reporters pushing microphones toward police officers. A hashtag was flashing across every screen in the station. Hashtag Stop the Fraud. It was trending nationwide. What's going on? Elijah asked. The officer behind the desk didn't look at him as he mumbled, "You're going home, Carter." His head snapped up. What? The guard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Your friend, the lawyer lady? She leaked everything. The whole damn internet is watching now. Vanessa. Elijah felt his breath hitch. She had done it. She had taken every document, every piece of proof, every forged signature, and blasted it across every platform, every news outlet, every legal forum in the country. They couldn't bury it now. And now, the world was watching. Elijah was barely out the door before Vanessa grabbed him by the shoulders. You okay? She asked, her voice tense but full of determination. Elijah nodded, still trying to process everything. Vanessa turned, pointing toward the mass of reporters. They know. They all know. We have to keep pushing. Before he could say a word, she was already leading him toward a podium hastily set up on the courthouse steps. Microphones flashed, voices shouted his name, but all he could focus on was one sentence Vanessa whispered to him before handing him the microphone. They tried to silence you. Now it's your turn to speak. Elijah took a deep breath. And then he did. He told them everything. About his grandmother. The fraudulent documents. The 43 families who had lost their homes. The corrupt judge. The fake notary. And by the time he was done, no one in that crowd was silent. People cheered, shouted, demanded answers. Within hours, civil rights lawyers flooded the courthouse, demanding an immediate investigation into Judge Pickett, Conrad Whitmore, and Whitmore Enterprises. Then, just when Elijah thought things couldn't get any bigger, the FBI stepped in. It didn't take long. The moment the FBI started digging, the entire house of cards collapsed. Judge Pickett's history of corruption was exposed. Decades of illegal rulings in favor of corporate giants like Whitmore Enterprises. He was disgraced, stripped of his position, and arrested. Graham Sloan was disbarred. Every case he had ever handled was thrown into question. His name was dragged through the mud, his reputation destroyed. And Conrad Whitmore? He tried to run. News cameras caught footage of him at the airport, his expensive luggage being hauled toward a private jet. But he never made it. FBI agents intercepted him on the tarmac. His face, the same smug, arrogant face that had mocked Elijah just days before, was plastered across every screen in the country. Whitmore Enterprises was shut down permanently. Every stolen home was returned to its rightful owner. And Elijah? Elijah had won. The next time Elijah walked into a courtroom, it was as a free man, a victor, a symbol of defiance against corruption. He stood tall as the new judge, one without a history of dirty deals, officially ruled in his favor. The foreclosure was voided. His grandmother's home? Restored to his name. Elijah closed his eyes as relief flooded through him. It was over. The battle was won. But the war? That was just beginning. Weeks later, Elijah sat on the same porch where his grandmother had once rocked in her chair, the house now legally and rightfully his. But this wasn't the end. Because as he looked through the messages filling his phone, he realized how many more families had suffered the same fate. People from across the country were reaching out. They had been scammed. They had been threatened. They had been silenced. Until now. Elijah Carter was no longer just a man fighting for his home. He was an advocate, a leader, a symbol of what happens when you refuse to back down. And the next time corruption tried to take what belonged to the people, they'd have to go through him first. Elijah Carter's journey wasn't just about one house, one battle, or one courtroom. It was about something far bigger, far deeper, something that affects countless people every single day. His story is a reminder that power doesn't belong only to the wealthy, the privileged, or those who sit in high places making decisions that strip people of their dignity. Power belongs to those who refuse to back down. For too long, the world has taught us to accept injustice as part of life, to believe that corruption is too big to fight, that powerful men like Conrad Whitmore will always win, and that people like Elijah Carter are meant to lose. But Elijah proved them all wrong. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't have money, influence, or connections. What he had was the truth and the courage to wield it like a weapon against those who thought they were untouchable. And here's the lesson for all of us. If you don't stand up, they'll take everything. Maybe for you, it's not a house. Maybe it's your rights, your dignity, your future. But no matter what it is, if you let corruption, injustice, and oppression win without a fight, you've already lost. Elijah could have walked away. He could have accepted the loss, convinced himself that he didn't stand a chance, and disappeared into the background like so many before him. But he chose to fight. And because he didn't just win his case, he changed everything. He exposed an entire network of corruption. He brought down powerful men who thought they were invincible. He gave a voice to every person who had been robbed, ignored, and pushed aside. He turned his battle into a movement, one that ensured no other family would ever suffer the same injustice again. Now, here's the real question for you. What will you do when it's your turn? Because make no mistake, injustice is everywhere. Maybe it's in your community. Maybe it's in your workplace. Maybe it's in the laws that were written to serve a few while stepping on the rest. The world doesn't change on its own. It changes when people like you decide to fight. And that's why Elijah's story matters. It's not just fiction. It's a reflection of the real battles being fought every day. So if you believe in justice, if you believe in fighting back against those who abuse their power, then stand with Elijah. Like this video to show your support for the fight against corruption. Comment below, what would you have done in Elijah's shoes? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for yourself against impossible odds? And most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Because this story is just the beginning. There are more battles to fight, more injustices to expose, and more stories of resilience, courage, and victory that need to be told. So stay with us. Because the fight isn't over. And when the next battle comes, we'll be here, standing together, speaking the truth, and refusing to back down.